Do any of you remember those magic eye puzzles? They were a really big thing in the 90s. So I remember we'd get our Saturday's paper and it would have a weekly magazine inside, and every single week they'd have one of those magic eye puzzles. And if you've never seen one, basically they have repeated pictures in a pattern. So I don't know, you'd have like 10 dancing teddy bears, and if you went cross-eyed as you looked at them, out would pop like a man in a tuxedo or something like that. I did that every week for months, and I think I saw it one time. I never could really get it to work. All my family members would say, "No, can't you see this? It's a dog, it's a windmill, it's whatever it is, it's a cat. How can't you see that?" But I just couldn't see it. And the Bible can be a bit like that. Jesus can be a bit like that. Perhaps you're not a Christian, and you hear the Bible read, and you hear your Christian friends talking about it, and you think, why is it they're seeing that I'm not seeing? Why are they convinced that this guy is God, when it seems to me just a bunch of words? Or as a Christian, you might hear a life-changing sermon and you think, this must have affected the person next to me, and they go home and they seem unconvinced. What's the reason for that? Well, you know, that happened from the very beginning. When Jesus came, the vast majority of people didn't believe that he was who he said he was. Now, that wasn't actually because they weren't convinced by the miracles. That's what most people think. No, we know that they were convinced the miracles were true, interestingly enough. But what they weren't convinced of was that this showed that he was God. So these people were looking at the same events that didn't normally happen, and they reached very different conclusions. Why does that happen? Why did that happen then, and why does it happen as we read these things today? Well, we're going to see that in this passage. We're going to see three things as we look at three different groups of people. First, we'll see in Jesus a display of the light of the world. And secondly, we'll see in the Pharisees a display of spiritual blindness. And finally, we'll see in the blind man who gained his sight a display of spiritual sight. So first of all, let's look at the miracle itself in verses 1 to 7, and we'll see a display of the light of the world. So as this passage begins, Jesus and his disciples are just walking down a road and they pass a blind man. Now, the way that disciples and their teacher worked is that they would ask questions of their rabbi, their teacher. And that's what they do here, seeing this blind man. Verse 1, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The assumption at the time was that the only reason someone would be blind would be as a punishment for sin. But that posed a conundrum to these men. If he was born blind, whose sin is he being punished for? Did he sin in utero before he was born? Or did his parents sin? And if so, why is the punishment being taken on him? That's their question. But of course, the disciples are asking the wrong question. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, Jesus isn't saying this man and his parents were perfect, that they'd never ever sinned at any point in their lives. What he's saying is there isn't a direct link between their sin and the suffering of this man. It's not the case that one thing happens and then another equal thing happens. It's not like karma. It's not you do a bad thing and then a bad thing happens to you. I remember hearing a pastor tell of how a man came storming round to his house and banged on the door. Now, you should know that this pastor had a wife who was wheelchair bound. And the man knocked on the door and he claimed he'd had a word from the Lord, a revelation from God. And the pastor was told that he must have been committing adultery, and that was why his wife had this chronic condition. I don't know how he didn't manage to punch the guy, but he didn't, and he managed to convince him, look, I really am not having an affair. That's not what's going on here. Well, the man said, I must have misunderstood the message I got. It must be that your wife is having an affair. He couldn't think of any other explanation for this sin than that it was a result of for this suffering than it was a result of sin. And how destructive that thinking is. Some of you have been in churches like that, where you're prayed to be healed for, and if you're not healed straight away, well, the problem must be in you. You don't have enough faith, or you've committed something so bad in your past that you're being punished for it now. So you not only have to struggle with the suffering itself, you have to suffer with the shame of sin. Now let Jesus reassure you here. Of course you've sinned, and of course everyone in this room has sinned. But there is not a direct correspondence between sin and suffering. You aren't suffering because you are particularly sinful or particularly lacking in faith. There's another reason why this happens. So why was this man born blind? Well, Jesus explained that he was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, before we think about how that applies to our situation and our suffering, let's think of this man in particular. This particular man had been born blind so that God's work might be displayed. Jesus goes on in verse 4. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, this is very metaphorical language. What Jesus is saying is, you could only work during the daytime. They didn't have lights in those times. Everyone worked during the day and the day alone. Okay? He can only work while the light is there, and Jesus is the light of the world. So Jesus is saying there's a limited amount of time where I can do the works that God has given me to do, my time on earth. So whilst I'm on earth, I'm going to do these works that reveal God. So what Jesus is saying is that this miracle is a picture of what God is like. It is part of Jesus' teaching. Jesus doesn't just teach with his words, he teaches with his actions. So God's power is being revealed by Jesus in the actions he's about to do. Well, what actions does he do? It goes on, verses 6 to 7. After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. So this is a visual picture Jesus is giving to show that whoever trusts in him and does what he says will be able to spiritually see, just like this man was able to physically see. The clay on his eyes was unclean, and so it was symbolic of the fact that because of uncleanness, this man couldn't see correctly, spiritually speaking. But if he follows Jesus' instructions and washes in this pool of Siloam, which means sent, somewhere he's been sent to by God, then that unclean blindness will be washed away. Or when he trusted Jesus' words, the man's blindness was healed. And that's a picture for all of us, that if we trust Jesus, our spiritual blindness washed away. Now, what does that mean for us and our suffering? Well, we've got to always remember that Jesus' primary role on earth wasn't to do miracles that relieved human suffering in the present. The purpose of those miracles wasn't primarily to heal the suffering that was happening there and then. When I was younger, I remember a visiting preacher came to a church I was in, and he talked about a miracle of Jesus, and he said, look, Jesus healed people, so it's wrong for us to say that he can't heal now. I was quite convinced of that at the time, but actually this passage shows why that thinking is wrong. Even when Jesus performed miracles, it wasn't just for the sake of healing a human condition. It was pointing to something bigger. They were pointing to him saving the world. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we can't pray for healing or for non-spiritual needs. Simon prayed for some things before in the service, and we're encouraged to do that. But sometimes the answer to our prayers will be no. And there are some things that we never see happen. I used to, when I lived in Stockton, I used to preach about once or twice a year for a group of Christian blind people. There was lots of encouraging things. They were reading the Bible in Braille. They were listening to audiobooks. They had non-Christian friends come and hear the gospel in that setting. But let me tell you, I never heard of someone who had been born blind suddenly being able to see. It didn't happen. So what do we do with that? Many say it's just because those people didn't have enough faith. Well, this verse tells us it's rubbish. Sin is not the cause for human suffering. Jesus' miraculous works were for a period to teach us a greater lesson. We have a deeper sickness, a deeper blindness, and Jesus was showing that he was going to deal with that. Imagine someone has a brain tumor and a paper cut. When they go to the doctors, they're not disappointed that the doctor focuses on the brain tumor rather than the paper cut. The individual problems we have are paper cuts compared to the bigger problem of sin. Sin is the cause of all suffering in the world. And if we die in our sins, it will be the cause of suffering for all eternity. So it's right that Jesus focuses on eternal salvation rather than individual miracles for individual situations. Now that can be a great encouragement to you if you have a chronic condition that you're never going to recover from. It could be that that's a physical chronic condition where you know you are not going to get better. Your knee is never going to get better before you pass away. Or perhaps you have energy problems or an ongoing immunity problem. Maybe it can be a mental condition. You struggle with depression, anxiety. You struggle with self-image, and that may never go away. It's not, though, because you have particularly bad faith or you've done a particularly bad thing in your past. Well, why does it happen then, you might ask? Well, it'll be something like this man, so that the works of God might be displayed. We don't know the reason for every single thing that happens in our life. I don't think we will do until Jesus explains it to us when he returns. But we know God's overarching aim is to save the world in Christ. And for whatever meaning that means, your suffering is serving an end that is greater than your healing. It's healing you from the biggest problem in the universe. That doesn't mean you can't pray for healing, but as you pray, you also pray, Father, if you don't take this suffering away, use it for your glory. Now, if you're coming to Jesus, I think this is vital because a lot of people, they come to Jesus initially to solve individual problems in their lives. And there's no shame in wanting to have God impact your life in all its challenges. But you've got to understand that when you become a Christian, all your problems don't suddenly disappear. You will still struggle with physical sickness. You may struggle with mental trials and temptations. Everyone in this room is suffering and will suffer until the day they go to glory. But the big point of Jesus is that he is the light of the world. He's dealing with our biggest problem, the darkness of sin. He comes in glorious light and removes each piece of sin and suffering from the world. That's what he's going to do primarily. He's revealing that to us now. And one day he will return and rid the earth of suffering and sin. And that's what this miracle is showing you. Your eyes are blind. They're covered with mud. And he has come to open those eyes. He has come so that trusting in him, you may see the world rightly. He comes to tell you to wash your sin away in him. Jesus gives us a display of the light of the world. Now, one of the interesting things with John is he doesn't just tell us about the miracles and move on. He often tells us what happens after the miracles, and it's often not what you'd expect. I wonder what you expect to happen now. A blind man has been able to see. A man born blind. You'd think everyone would come to Jesus and believe in him, but that's not what happens. Here we see the Pharisees, and in their response, a display of spiritual blindness. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a play-by-play through this narrative, so follow with me the arguments that happen afterwards. Look at verse 8. His neighbours and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked. "I don't know," he said. So the people aren't sure if this is the same blind man. And that has the ring of truth about it, doesn't it? These people aren't thick, okay? They know that people born blind don't generally be able to see. They're probably assuming he's got some long-lost twin brother or something like that. That makes more sense than a blind man seeing. But the guy assures them, no, it really is me. Jesus gave me sight. So what do? Well, next they bring him to the Pharisees, the religious leaders. They know lots about the Bible. Surely they're going to have an opinion on this miracle. What happens? Verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who'd been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he'd received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. You think they'd see now, wouldn't you? You think that they'd be convinced. We were on the fence about this Jesus guy, but if he can heal a man born blind, he must be from God. But no, the vast majority of them are stuck on the fact that this happened on a Sabbath. Now, what's the Sabbath? Well, the Jews were told by God to not work one day of a week, which would have been Saturday for the Jews. Now, you're probably thinking, well, come on. Making a mud pie and sticking it on some guy's eyes is hardly work. And you're absolutely right. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, don't make mud on the Sabbath. Nowhere does it ever say, don't heal on the Sabbath. If Jesus had broken the law, then that would be a major problem because he's got to be sinless, as we talked about last time. But what happened was the Pharisees had added many rules to the law. So they had this idea that if you imagine that breaking the law is kind of this inner ring, they thought, well, let's put an extra fence of extra rules around the edge. And if people don't break them, then they're not going to accidentally break the actual biblical rules. So they added in all these extra rules that weren't in God's law. The problem is that God knew exactly what he was doing when he set the boundaries in his law. And these guys did not. They thought it was helping them to do what was right, yet it blinded them to the obvious conclusion about Jesus. If he was a sinner, why would God allow him to do this? They asked the man what he thinks. And then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. Now, a prophet is someone who speaks from God. And that is a sensible conclusion. It's not the whole way, as we'll see later on. But the Old Testament says that if someone is able to say something happened and it happens, then that proves that man is from God. Obviously something more unusual than you'd expect. If somebody gives a prophecy, you know it's true if their prophecy comes true. So surely Jesus must at the very least be a prophet. He must come from God. Actually, in the Old Testament, there's not as many miracles as you'd expect there to be. When there were miracles, it tended to be around important figures like Moses or Elijah or Elisha. Big life-changing moments in Old Testament history had these great miracles attached to them. But they don't see what this blind man sees. Their blindness continues. Verse 18. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? We know he's our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age, he'll speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So the parents confirmed, no, this really is our son. He really was born blind. But they avoid making the obvious conclusion about Jesus. Now, why is this? You might think it's because they don't know who Jesus is, but that's not the case. The reason they won't mention Jesus is because they know if anyone claims Jesus is the Messiah, they get put out of the synagogue. And that would have made them a social pariah. They don't want to run the risk. They're just going to keep out of this situation. He's old enough, he can speak for himself. I don't want to have anything to do with it. What a picture of human blindness. The Pharisees had already decided that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. They were even kicking people out of the synagogue before they'd really analysed who he was. So often we reject Jesus or his word because of something we've already decided. We don't come to Jesus and say, what have you to teach me, Lord? Rather, we come with our own view of the world and see if Jesus fits that. If he does, great. If he doesn't, well then, we run away. Perhaps for some of us, we're like the parents here. We're too scared of what other people might think to believe in Jesus. Or perhaps we're like the Pharisees who've already decided who Jesus is, and no evidence will change that. That's human nature through and through. That's spiritual blindness. Well, they haven't got a solution. Verse 24. A second time they summoned the man who'd been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. Again, they're not weighing things up. Saying, we know this man's a sinner. Just give in. Tell us the truth. They've already made their decision. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I've already told you, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples? The blind man won't let them go round and round in circles. He says, you know he's healed me. I've told you how it's happened. Either become his disciples or don't. But that's the option before you. And that really riles the Pharisees. Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. What he literally says there is, ever since the beginning of the world, this has never happened. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. What are they going to do with that? Well, to this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. The blind man absolutely schools these men, doesn't he? They're boasting about being disciples of Moses, yet Moses told them that if a prophet's word came true, then he was really from God, and they're not listening. The man's logic is flawless. If Jesus was from Satan, God wouldn't let this miracle happen. And yet their response is simply to throw insults at him. The Pharisees believed he was punished for being blind, but it doesn't make sense. He now can see they just don't want to listen. They just don't want to have their view of the world challenged. Now, at the end of this, Jesus goes and speaks to the man born blind. We'll come back to that in a few moments' time. But skip down to verses 39 to 40. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what, are we blind too? What's Jesus saying here? Well, Jesus often talks about how he turns the world on its head. And that's what we see here. The Pharisees who could physically see were unable to see spiritually. And the blind man who formerly could not physically see was able to see spiritually perfectly. What does he mean when he says, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim to see, your guilt remains? I think what he's saying is this. If they came to him and said, look, Jesus, we don't know what's going on. We're blind. Help us to see. Then Jesus, of course, would have helped them. The problem is that they're claiming they can see, and so they can't come to anyone for help. That explains their argument, doesn't it? They already believed they saw. They already believed it was a sin to heal on the Sabbath. They already believed that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. They already believed he was a sinner. They simply could not see. They were blind, and they weren't willing to accept their blindness. What's the solution to this kind of blindness? Well, Jesus has already said it to the Pharisees. The problem's not that you're blind. It's that you claim to see. When I was younger, I was told I needed to wear glasses, but I was a really self-conscious teenager, and I thought, I'm not going to wear glasses at school. And that was fine when my sight was slightly dodgy. But as time went on, my sight got worse and worse and worse. And teachers decided to put me right at the back of the room, so I couldn't even squint at the board. So what I started to do was copy off the person next to me. And one of my joker friends realized that's what I was doing. So they decided to write down deliberately the wrong answers, or at least the wrong questions, so that I would be tricked. Now, I was furious with him, but the reality was that there was a simple solution. I was blind, and I just needed to put on my glasses. I just needed to admit it. But it's the same with us and God. So long as we think we can see without Jesus, we'll only ever be getting the wrong answers. If we're humble enough to say to Jesus, I am blind, help me to see, then and only then will we understand reality rightly. We like to think that we're rational. We like to think all the opinions we hold about the world are logical. But so often we're clouded by our preconceptions and our sins. We've decided we don't want to believe in God, so we're not going to consider another possibility. We've decided this thing is right, and anyone who goes against it is wrong. And that is spiritual blindness too. As long as we're not humble enough to admit our blindness, we won't see the truth. There's almost no point in looking into Jesus until you've considered the possibility that the way you see the world now could be wrong and Jesus could be right. That's the start. If not, like the Pharisees, it's just going to bounce off you. Before we finish, let's look at this formerly blind man. So we've seen Jesus is the display of the light of the world. We've seen in the Pharisees the display of spiritual blindness. And now in the formerly blind man, we see a display of spiritual sight. What does it look like to see spiritually? Well, we've seen a few things, particularly when he takes on the Pharisees, but the big picture is in verses 35 to 38. This is the real healing of the blind man. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him, the blind man, out when he'd found him. He said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. The blind man, if you remember, had shown incredible spiritual insights, but the Pharisees were reduced to insults and then they threw him out. Now, I imagine he wasn't just thrown out of the room. I imagine that just as we said before, they were throwing people out of the synagogue who believed in Jesus. I imagine that's what's happened. And I think it's great that Jesus goes to him. He hears this. He hears that he's being persecuted for his faith in Jesus, and Jesus comes right to him, puts his arm around him. And then he says to this man, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Now, if you're not familiar with the Bible, you might be expecting Jesus to say, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" Why would he say the Son of Man? Well, in the Old Testament, there was this prophet called Daniel, and he had a vision of heaven. He saw all the angels, he saw God, and then he said that there was one seated next to God who was like a son of man, like a human being, and he was given authority over the earth. And this is one of the big mysteries of the Old Testament. Who is this guy who gets to sit next to God and rule the earth on behalf of God? A human being. I could understand an angel, but why is there this human being sat next to God? What kind of man gets to stand next to God and make rules about the universe? That's a big question for the Jews. And wisely, the man replies, "Well, who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. You're clearly a prophet. You opened my eyes. So, show me, tell me, who is that Son of Man?" Jesus' words to this man were washing the pool of Siloam. He did it and he was able to see, surely this man can be trusted to identify the Son of Man. Jesus replies, verse 37, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." He gives a stunning revelation. Who is the Son of Man? Who is this human being who is equal to God in heaven? It's me. And what the man does next is incredible. Verse 38, the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Now that is a remarkable thing for a Jew to do. Jews did not worship other human beings. But when Jesus reveals the truth to him, he believes straight away. He bows the knee in worship. That's how faith works. Many Christians in the room will recognize this. For some, there was a day when it just happened. It was all fog. They didn't see who Jesus was, and all of a sudden they believed and they worshipped Jesus. They would do anything for Jesus. For some of us, the exact day is unsure, but we know that what was once unclear is now clear. The Jesus we once didn't worship as God, now we would do anything for. The lights are on. Jesus is God. When you know that Jesus is God, you'll do anything for him. I'm reading a book at the moment which is called Everything Sad, Untrue. And it's a story about an Iranian boy whose mum became a Christian and the things that happened as a result of that. Becoming a Muslim in Iran is incredibly dangerous. So she was going to be put to death. And so she had to flee the country, which led to her husband divorcing her. In Iran, she was incredibly rich. In America, she was poor. She was a doctor in Iran. She worked in a factory in America. Why would she do this? Well, her son describes it like this. "When I tell the story in Oklahoma, this is the part when the grown-ups always interrupt me. They say, 'Okay, but why did she convert?' Because up to that point, I've told them about the house with the birds in the wall, all the villages my grandfather owned, all the gold, my mum's own medical practice, and all the amazing things she had that we don't have anymore because she became a Christian. All the money she gave up, so we're poor now. But I don't have an answer for them. How can you explain why you believe anything? So I just say what my mum says when people ask her. She looks them in the eye with the begging hope they'll hear, and she says, 'Because it is true.' Why else would she believe it? If you believe it's true that there is a God and he wants you to believe in him, and he sent his son to die for you, then it has to take over your life. It has to be worth more than anything else, because heaven's waiting on the other side. That's what happens when you become a Christian. If you truly believe that this is true, it's worth anything. It's worth being kicked out of the synagogue for this blind man. It's worth being divorced, poor, and exiled from your home country for this Iranian woman. And whatever lesser sacrifices we have to make for becoming a Christian, they're worth it as well, if this is true. So we've seen three things in this passage. First, in Jesus, we've seen a display of the light of the world. This miracle wasn't just a fancy upmarket medical procedure. It was showing us that if we trust in him, he can wash our spiritual blindness away. Second, in the Pharisees, we see a display of spiritual blindness. They have the evidence right in front of them, but they just don't see it. And pray to God that won't be true of you. Finally, in the formerly blind man, we see a display of spiritual sight. When Jesus reveals who he is, this man is willing to make a stand. He's willing to worship. He's willing to go against the Pharisees. He's willing to believe. Why? Like that Iranian woman, because it's true. Plead to God that he'll give you the kind of certainty that makes everything worth doing for him.